it is an enormous pleasure and an honor to be able to give this lecture. I really appreciate the invitation. I have always found myself both struggling and learning a lot from legal scholars. I also want to recognize the audience. I want to recognize the mayor of the city. I was born in this city, actually. I keep forgetting that, but I was born here. And my Nederlands is dus heel slecht, because I left when I was 2 years old. And that can be catastrophic for a language, you know what I mean? So it is sort of keuken-Nederlands. Very good. So one framing that I like to use that captures particularities of the current period is the notion of a rise of extractive logics. And by that I mean not just mining, nor do I just mean the water grabs by the Coca-Colas and Nestles of this world. There are a whole variety of other extractive modes that are happening. And I like to juxtapose this notion to the Keynesian period in our Western economies, which was marked by commerce and mass consumption. We still have commerce, we still have mass consumption, but this emergent rise of extractive logics really becomes sort of a dominant format that alters outcomes. Let me step back a bit and say that one of the questions that guides my research is how do complex systems change? And they do not change by changing everything. And they do not change necessarily in highly visible ways. So one way of describing the change of complex systems is to say that capabilities of time one, mixture of capabilities, shift to new organizing logics. That is a kind of change. But that's not always a visible change. So I find myself really struggling often when I have debates to explain, to convey, to capture this shift, this profound shift that has happened in our Western-style economies and societies as a consequence partly, because it is not very visible. And so one way of framing that, and I will sort of talk very, very briefly about that, is, for instance, the shift from the dominance of commerce and traditional banks to things like Google and all these various kinds of technologies, which Facebook, which have very little accountability. Facebook can publish whatever it wants. Wrong, false, doesn't matter. Think of a car manufacturer. Something is wrong, even a secondary item, and that car manufacturer has to send back 20,000 cars or whatever. So it is a strange world. In that context, then also, this notion of a rise of extractive logics is not so easy to track. For me, the master case that captures it very well is the rise of finance, which is a radically different form from traditional banking. Now, for me, exhibit number one is the United States, and exhibit number two is probably the UK. I always think of the continent, Europe, as a far more civilized kind of place where you also have changes, but there is also a mediating factor that enables the continuity of some good old modes of doing stuff. In the United States, and I'm not even thinking about the president, I don't want to talk about the president, but I'm just thinking about a far more complex feature than who's sort of the president of the country. And so one striking example for me is the traditional bank, and it will capture some of the elements that I get at, the traditional bank versus high finance. So the traditional bank is commerce, it sells something it has. Finance is radically different, nothing to do with microeconomics or macroeconomics. It is algorithmic math, and I am not blaming the physicists, who dominate the making of the instruments. And it is basically selling something it does not have. unlike the traditional bank, which sells what it has. So just to give you an illustration that captures the difference, and it's a simple example. Student debt in the United States has today reached $1 trillion. That is a significant amount of money. The traditional bank wouldn't know what to do with it. It's debt. The business of the traditional bank is to sell money. So what is it going to do with that? Finance, high finance, knows what to do with that. He says, $1 trillion, I can work with that. On top of that, they passed a law, they forced a law in our Congress that makes that a debt that can never be pardoned. I do hope that some new president comes in and does just cut through that. But that means that high finance can work with that 1 trillion multiplied for years, possibly. It's debt, doesn't matter, it can work with it. As a result, the value of high finance, the value of sort of a certain kind of finance, is now over $2 quadrillion. That's a lot of zeros, and they're all working. And that is so much more than, say, global GDP. Global GDP is much below 100 trillion. And the value of high finance is over $2 quadrillion. So all those zeros. I'm just looking at all these round things. They all look like zeros to me. I suddenly feel like I'm being attacked. I don't know if people have seen and it's all, oh my God, all those zeros. But I realize it's just a beautiful design. So I just mentioned this before immersing myself in the question of immigration to get at this notion of extractive logics, so that extractive logics are not just, Coca-Cola extracting water, killing the land. It is also very complex and intermediated, and in that sense, difficult to capture. So one other example to this difficulty, I find that the material in today's world doesn't quite have the capacity of being speech the way it was in past times. So if you are in Manhattan or in London or some cities, I don't think you have that yet here, but it might arrive. In Amsterdam, certainly. I don't know about The Hague. You see new towers, newly built towers that are empty, dark, and people think, ooh, poor investors. No poor investors. That building is delivering more profits because it is used to build asset-backed securities than if it were occupied by people who pay rent or who buy the flat. And again, a kind of invisibility that attaches to these new modes. So when I will speak, and I want to start now, of this notion that there is a third emergent subject in the migration story, beyond the two familiar subjects, the refugee and the immigrant, the regular immigrant. This subject is marked by a kind of invisibility. This subject is, in a way, the outcome of a whole variety of economic processes for which the examples that I gave you are just the most extreme examples. There are many other variations. So when the immigrant or the refugee appear at our borders, we can recognize them. They have standing in particular modes of law. This third subject doesn't have standing. This third subject, when she arrives at our borders, she's invisible to the eye of the law. I mean, her materiality is there, but she is invisible to the eye of the law. And it is partly, and here's the juxtaposition that matters in this analysis, it is partly because this migrant is a kind of, this third subject, is a kind of refugee from modes of development in their home countries that are registered as a positive. GDP per capita growth. When you set up a big plantation, and there are about 35 countries that are occupying other countries, especially in Africa, I must say, which are doing this. They're growing their food, etc. That is just one example. There are many more examples. But those large plantations don't just fall from the sky. They are made, and part of that making is the expulsion of significant numbers of smallholders. In the GDP per capita measure, standard measure for economic growth in a country, that juxtaposition, you expel large numbers of migrants to generate a plantation or a mine, or, you know, there can be all kinds of other things, or the, you know, but the notion is that you're expelling people. That registers as a positive, as GDP per capita growth. So when that expelled person appears at the border, what the knowledge that whoever the examiner has is, but that country is doing much better than it was doing. You're coming from a country where GDP per capita is growing. And in that juxtaposition resides an invisibility to the eye of the law, because it just doesn't work. Now, if you want to understand it, of course you can understand it, and it might take you 1 minute. But that is not how a legal system necessarily works. Now, so that is sort of a key element. I want to bring in a methodological question, because I think that, coming back to this notion, how do complex systems change? I think that the question of method in this current period, partly because of what I just described as one instance, or also the case of finance for that matter, traditional methods in the social sciences, traditional economics and traditional sort of social sciences, are not capturing some of this. The paradigmatic modes that we have belong to an earlier era. And this era, for me, this new era starts really, you know, in the 1980s, when we privatize, deregulate, and globalize. We globalize along particular vectors. We have long had global operations in the West, certainly, but this is a very particular mode of globalizing. And that means, in my reading, that a lot of the social sciences, and I'm including economics in this, is actually failing to capture a growing sort of set of modus operandi for, especially thinking about economic actors, but it is also other actors, that actually is sort of lost. And so in that sense, I find myself literally needing, a space that I have called before method, which I think is a beautiful phrase. I love that phrase. So before method is a space that allows me the freedom to check out the edges of the paradigm, where the paradigm is weak, because a lot of the action is happening there. So I'm very interested, not in the strong heart of the paradigm, which continues to exist, but in the edges. And a question that I have, just I cannot help but in this space, is whether in legal scholarship, you also have this particular moment where the heart of whatever the paradigmatic format of different modes of law, the heart is strong. But what's happening at the edges, where the paradigm loses traction, where it becomes weak, where other stuff is emergent because the paradigm is weak, that we can see, that we can capture. And sort of in there, for me, also hangs something about really what we don't see. And what we don't see is a very significant part, often, of a transformative process. So, and what I call this is analytic tactics, tactical analytics, which is sort of, for me, a very reassuring concept. I actually love that concept. I think tactical analytics, I mean, it sounds positively elegant. So that makes me all very happy. And here I just want to very briefly touch on a few of these. This is I really am going to do exercise for my neck here. So just one of these I want to emphasize. I already alluded to it. The need to actively destabilize stable meanings. The paradigm's heart is still strong. A lot of the categories are very important, but we also need to destabilize in order to interrogate the possibility of changed conditions. And again, I'm just very curious, and perhaps in the discussion we can get to it, to understand how does this work for law? After all, there have really been foundational transformations, and I'm just going to bring up again the example of high finance. How do legal scholars who are also interested in what is emergent, what is not fully there, what is not yet recognized as dominant, but might well become dominant. How do you handle that? I just go in the field. So the field can be an abstract field, or it can be actual concrete field. And I just want to discover. So discovery is one mode in which a social scientist can do this. I would be very curious to know how a legal scholar can engage that. Now, so this is here, this notion that we can think of these new migrations that I was capturing, that they signal something, not just about themselves, also about the economy back home, as I already said, but also about new histories. And the term history here, I want it to be working hard, particular trajectories, if you want. So we have, as I already said, two established subjects. I'm going to skip that. And then we have this third emergent subject. Right. So I'm going to have to start moving a bit here, and I can do that, right? Nothing? Yeah. So there are a whole set of conditions that actually wind up producing this third model. And here I just mention a few. The expulsions of people, transformed economies, etc., produce this new migrant subject. I repeat, when she appears at our borders, there is no law to recognize her in her fullness. And so, to me, this is a very important issue. And furthermore, what I didn't say, what I will say now, is the fact that as we know, the refugee law was a bit transformed, but it needs a very serious changing, especially because war is no longer a war where the hegemonic powers can sit around a table and after 5 years of battle say, okay, enough war, let's go back to business. We have asymmetric wars. The United States has now been 11 years in Iraq, and there is no end to that war, because the asymmetric warriors, they don't gain anything by that. So the hegemons that could, in our historic past, certainly in Europe, make a decision. Look at the 2 world wars. They each lasted about 5 years, and they said enough. That is out. That is no longer an option. So, there are a whole number of significant emergent trends which affect only a minority of people and situations, but they are significant. Oh, this is a bit awkward here. See, yet another element to mark my way of thinking the migration question, which is that migrations are derivative. They are part of larger systems that are often international. So the notion that the migration starts when the migrant appears at the border, so to speak, whether the border is a border back home that allows her to leave, etc., for a particular country, or whether it is the border of a country where she wants to enter. The notion that she's outside of a system is a problem. She's inside, which means that whatever is happening in her country that is making her leave, it is quite possible that the country to which she wants to go is also involved in that. In other words, one way of putting it, a very brutal way that I like to use in the United States, is that many of the migrations that came to the United States started in the boardroom of the Pentagon. You understand what I'm saying? The first time we had this very serious migrations of Dominicans to the United States was because we invaded the Dominican Republic, because they had elected a socialist, but regular sort of, regular socialist, regular party politics, a president. And so we invaded. That was under Reagan. That built a bridge. Because when you have soldiers on the land, you need all kinds of things to feed them, to this, to that. The Dominican can say, well, if I can do it here for them, I can also do it in the United States for them. Those migrations began then. Similar story, I can repeat it case after case after case. Why do we have so many Filipinos in the United States? Well, because we have a military base in Philippines. So when you begin to look at it that way, you understand that migrations, it's not just simply people who decide to move. Migrations emerge in a context that is often quite international in the literal sense, more than one country involved. So the whole notion of the border for the migrant, you know, it's a very partial element in the story of migrations. Having said that, the next argument that one can make is, aha, when a new migrant appears at our borders, she's telling us something about back home that is probably connected to elements that are not simply particular to that country, but that have gone into that country. I hope that my shorthand works here, right? You understand what I'm saying? Right? In other words, we may have developed a factory there, a mining operation, a little invasion of the military, etc., and then, you know, and that is also why we have so few migrants. The migrant as a strong subject, not refugees, is very different. But when you look at migrations and when you look at the inequalities between countries, so when people say, oh, well, migrants come because they have so many more opportunities in the country of, you know, where they want to immigrate to, that's a very problematic assertion, because then far more people should be aiming at migration. There are very few of those who migrate, 250,000. That is, I mean, yeah, that is very, very few. So what is happening in terms of how we understand this subject? You know, it's not properly positioned. And in that sense, when I argue, it's probably an extreme argument that I'm making, that the migration process often begins in the boardrooms of particular countries. It can be economic boardrooms or they can be political boardrooms. Now, when we begin to think about migration that way, then there is an issue of the territorial that also emerges. So I'm very interested in disaggregating, well, in using the category territory and disaggregating it. So I now am working on multiple territorialities that are very partial, that occupy pieces of different countries, but that are territorialities. Certainly you see it in very advanced economic sectors, like in high finance you see that. But you also see it in other operations. I like to argue that, for instance, if you look at the major financial centers in the world, of which there are, you know, there are probably about 70 or so that are really significant players. They are a very material operation, no matter how digitized they also are, no matter how abstract financial instruments are. They occupy a physical zone. It's like I always thought of the global city, that a system installs itself in those cities. Remember that our cities were all poor in the 1970s. New York was officially broke, Paris was poor, London was poor, Tokyo was poor. Why? Because the economies at that time were not sited. The heart of those economies was not urban, as it is a bit now. It was outside. It was building the suburbs. It was building infrastructure, etc., etc. So what happens then in the 1980s, 1990s is the beginning of this new globalization, because we deregulated, we privatized, etc., etc. And it sort of installs itself. This is a very massive physical operation, a financial sector which deals with very abstract instruments, algorithmic math, etc., etc. And the digital is critical. So this is an interesting juxtaposition. Those financial centers, to put it a bit unkindly, they get whatever they want, and they don't really care about the larger country. In that sense, that's another sort of element of extractiveness. In other words, they just have this operational field. Now, I like to juxtapose that with human rights activists who want to go to particular places and go digging to extract remains of people that have been tortured, etc. This is happening, you know. They have to get a permit to access the country. They're not interested in the country. They're interested in that territory where those tortured bodies were buried. So we have a lot of that. When you begin to look, so it's both the positive and the negative. We have an enormous variety of this stuff happening. What I want to pull out, vis-a-vis also the larger question of migration, is a sort of a breaking down, at least in certain countries. The United States might be extreme, Russia might be extreme, and so there are good examples. But it's happening in different ways. This is not a highly visible process. And when you begin to put it all together, number one, that often the migrations begin in the boardrooms of big corporations or governments. This notion of the territorial as beginning to suffer with globalization, with internationalization, etc., beginning to suffer a bit in terms of its integrity. Now, Europe is really the exception. Europe, you have a strong sense, no matter European Union, but the United States, one very simple way of putting it is the United States has a lot of dead land and dead water. And that dead land and that dead water, which is still a material condition, is invisible. They don't care about it. There are vast stretches in the United States where the government is zero present because it's dead, because you cannot get anything out of it. And so for me, the question then becomes, and again, the US and Russia, the two cases I'm looking at, are very extreme. What does the government actually govern when it comes to national territory? You understand the question, right? Sort of, it doesn't necessarily govern the whole territory. And then when you add what I was saying, the financial center, big insertion, very material, very much connected globally via the digital moment. There is an issue of governance here. Now, in that context, then back to the migration question. There is that other migration, and it's like very difficult to nail down that figure. Very difficult to update the refugee regime. Very difficult to update the migrant regime. These are all regimes, well, two regimes and one is not yet a regime, that actually need some very serious updating given all these other transformations. I'm speaking in shorthand. I'm just hoping that I'm not losing you here. Now, I want to go to these three flows that sort of capture back to the migration question via migration, capturing some of the issues that I'm talking about. And so the first one is the Central America, where what I want to look at are the migrations of children. I don't know if people have heard of this, but this is a new phenomenon. They come from Central America, which is considered one of the most violent areas in the world. And they manage to cross the whole of Mexico, and then they arrive. So several 100,000 have arrived. The youngest one is 8 years old. You know what it means to cross Mexico. You have an idea of that, right? It's a major challenge. It's a huge country. We don't know all the ones that don't make it, that are actually rescued by nice churches on the road, or that are taken into the global slave trade. I mean, we don't know that. So that's one of them. The other one is the Myanmar story that I have gotten very engaged by, and I have sort of a set of other elements that are not usually mentioned. I am not going to focus on the European, whether Europe is the main destination. You all know much more about it than I do, and it is sort of it has so many different strands in it. So the other two are sort of simpler. Now, each of these migrations that I'm talking about is also pointing, literally pointing, to areas of origin. And the areas of origin vary enormously. But it's not just the person leaving to survive. It is also that the migrant is a carrier of an added bit of knowledge, which is back home. Because most people do not migrate. This is a fact that many people do not know. They assume that the whole world is migrating. It is not. So when a migration begins, once a migration is in place, it sort of becomes an automatic thing. But the key point for me is a new migration, an emergent migration. And so these in the case of Myanmar, the Rohingya, I'm focusing, of course, on the Rohingya, what has happened in this latest phase is different from prior phases. They have been there for a very long time. They have regularly been persecuted, never persecuted as they have in the last period, which has led me again to ask the question that I always ask is, what is happening? What else is happening? Because these people, you know, and is it just religion? Or is there something else? And yes, there is something else, and the data has finally come out. So now, right. So this first point here, that the two flows I focus on emerge from situations that are larger than the internal logics of households. Once you have a migration that exists and that goes on, it's the logics of households that take over. I'm sort of interested in how does a migration begin? You know, why does it start? And again, the background here is that most people do not migrate, right? So they emerge often from sharply delineated conditions operating at a whole variety of levels. You know, it depends what migration you are looking at. Extreme violence is often one vector, but it is not the only one. So for me, very important, I wrote a very long article about this, is the way international development has been handled. Very problematic for a whole variety of reasons. This is too complex. So it seems to me that one vector in play in these migrations begins 30 years ago. And then finally it reaches a moment of crisis. This has to do with development policies, with the fact that, I mean, it goes back, it includes, for instance, when OPEC is established, when the oil-producing countries decide to take over the oil business from the Americans and the whatever, the other nationalities, the French. They have all this amazing amount of money suddenly because of the price of oil. Some of you may remember this or may know about it. If they would have kept that money and just stored it, some histories would have been different. But they decided to ask Western-style corporations and banks to make that money work. One issue that comes out of that is a massive amount of lending to global South governments who were literally told, take it. At that point, we're not talking high finance, we're talking basically traditional banking, which means you want to sell the money. And so they pushed it literally down the throats of a very large number of poorish countries. And those countries then were unable, eventually with corruptions and I don't know what all, unable to pay the loans. And so the crisis happens, and then we enter more familiar territory. And the corruptions and the crises also meant that there were a lot of desperate people. But even those desperate migrants, and some of them were refugees, some of them were just traditional migrants, you know, only some went. I will do extreme conditions of economies that literally were falling apart. If we think of Africa, which is an extreme site in this logic, in the 1960s, Africa actually had a lot of local manufacturing. You know, they were really getting it together. And then comes this selling of these loans. And that was a very destructive moment. Again, I have a very long analysis of that. I'm pretty persuaded by the data that I have seen. So I just use this example to signal long histories very often behind the emergence of a migration. And that is why recognizing that most people do not migrate, even though most people in the world are poor. The majority are poor. Modestly, sort of very modest working classes or practically poor. And these are the issues that are never confronted when we talk about immigration. The full burden of the migration is put on the migrant herself. And that is not going to lead us to good policy. Now, I want to move on a bit more. I'm just going to then there is a whole set of the destructions of habitat that we have nowadays. That becomes a very significant mode through which expulsions happen. You know, people just lose land. And I'm just going to go through all of this very quickly. This is amazing data and blah, blah. And the the earth. I'm not talking just about the weather. Earth is getting hot. And so I love to mention the Midwest in the United States, which is very proud of itself. When you see the fields, they all look beautiful. The temperature has been growing, growing, growing. And when land gets hot, it's dying. So it still looks green because of all the fertilizers, but it's dying. So these are all factors that in global south countries take extreme conditions. Water scarcities are everywhere. I mean, it's just amazing. We now have many places that don't have water. They need to truck in the water, even in the United States. If we executed all the policies that we have, in the narrow sense about climate change, that would be the difference, according to scientists. Very little difference. Not enough. We need much more than the policy aspect, which always moves slowly. So when people, I want to just stop here a bit. So when people are pushed out of their land, the small farmers, they're replaced by a mine, a plantation, a water grabbing operation, you know, whatever. Where do those people go? They are sort of invisible refugees of a mode of economic development. They disappear mostly in the big slums of our cities, where we lose the track. They are part of families or whatever who for generations have protected the land and made it deliver goods, right? They have knowledge. They have knowledge that the plantations don't have, because the plantations, after 70 years, guaranteed the land is dead. Where do they go? We don't even know. They are not even part of migration streams very often, but they are, in a way, refugees of modes of economic development where I started, where the development measure looks fantastic in those countries. Now, this is one image that I love, a format of the future. Vast, what we call in Latin America, la periferia, small houses, regular, irregular. And then my other subject is all these big towers that are getting built in our cities, right, that have a very different, it's this juxtaposition. Now, again, Europe is totally different. You in Europe have really managed to sort of keep a reasonable, and this is another juxtaposition here, right? But this is beginning to, in the global south, broadly understood, you see a lot of this, and I'm sure that and when there is no land, we're building the shanties on water. So one issue that is happening is a loss of habitat that has become very extreme and that we're not measuring. Back to my initial statement, what we measure is the growth factor that produces the loss of habitat. Now, I just want to move. So there are these migrations. This is the final section. These migrations that are marked by violence, and in this case especially, usually violence is mentioned. La violencia is like a phrase in Latin America that is used, la violencia. And the question of religious persecution, the case again of the Rohingya is one case. And so these are two increasingly common explanations for a certain type of emigration. They are often an easy way, in my reading. I mean, I as a scholar and researcher, I have to interrogate. I can't just accept. Most people accept because they see it as self-evident. One has to interrogate because violence doesn't fall from the sky. So just to ready-made. So just to say there is violence there, that's why they came. Wait a minute, let me check out what produced the violence, etc. And similarly with the question of religion. Is religion the deep cause, or is religion, yes, deep cause for some, but also something that needs to be interrogated, just a stand-in for something that is quite different, which I think is the case in Myanmar. Yes, we already sort of saw this. And so the children. right? This is a very important example of something that is slightly misunderstood at the level of policy and at the level, I would say, sort of general understanding. So this is what happens, right? You see the year 2011. These are the three Central American countries. An amazing upwards curve. This is an extreme curve. And again, these are minors. I'm only talking about minors. So I think we assume that a lot of them never make it across Mexico because there's a lot of violence in Mexico. And so I should back up here. So in the case of what is happening in Central America, the explanation that you see also among scholarship is violence. So I decided to sort of check out, well, what kind of violence? And the notion is drug violence in the cities. Well, it turns out that many of these children lost their parents, yes, in cities, yes, due to drug violence. But the parents were actually rural workers, the rural small landowners who were expelled from the land, who were illegally expelled, really. And in fact, I got into a real big trouble with one of the biggest landowners in Honduras, who's called Dinant, who then sent his lawyer to me, etc., because it turns out that by the millions, and Cáceres, I don't know if anyone, the human rights activist who was murdered about a year ago, and now they are sort of pursuing the issue. There is a company that actually sent, in Honduras also, that sent people to kill her. She was one of those who was fighting for the rights of indigenous people. To make a very complicated story that has many elements, very simple, what happened in Honduras and happened in Salvador and happened also in Guatemala to some extent, is, but Honduras is the most extreme case, is that people have been expelled from their rural situations, in a very short and brutal history. Many human rights activists have been killed. The most famous one is Berta Cáceres, but there are others, including people who were not from Central America. And in the end, a lot of these small holders, small farmers, the only place they could go to was to the cities. But their lives had been destroyed by what happened in the rural area. Moreover, the form that the rural area took, and it included a World Bank award to that person, Dinant, who had his private army of killers. The World Bank gave him an award because he had modernized the economy. And this is a trap. I mean, it is good to modernize an economy, but the cost also has to be recognized. So I then wrote this article where I said, you know, to just separate these two stories is a mistake. These stories are very connected. But there was a group, a world, if you want, within the World Bank who saw him as a developer who was doing well. And then there were the other people who are looking at land grabs, who are, you know, a certain kind of lawyer, human rights lawyer, etc. So this is a classic example, I would say, of what I started out with. A certain kind of situation where the country shows, wow, this is great, GDP per capita growth, you modernize, and at the same time you are expelling a lot of people. This is happening in a lot of countries. And so the measures that we have somehow prevent us, because we see growth, we say that must be good for everybody, prevent us from recognizing what is really going on. And then the other one is the question of religious persecution. So I did a lot of checking out. I was attacked, I was criticized, and I said, look, this extent of persecution of the Rohingya does not fit in a long history of persecution that they have had in Myanmar. This was absolutely extreme. You have seen all the articles, right? 700,000 is the estimate that went. The whole debate in the media by very good people who actually are telling what is really part of the story, but it's part of the story, is religious persecution. No. Religious persecution was there, and they have regularly had it, but what happened this time had a completely different source. And the military did most of the work. They destroyed 300 villages. Now, they destroyed these villages in a very short period of time, And it was not like past destructions, where they would just sort of burn and destroy and that. No, they created a zone of burned land where there was no trace of who had been there. That was a difference. And that put me on the alert. So I do a lot of work in China and about China, so I began to check it out. And so I found out that the Chinese, and I'm not criticizing China, okay? I like a lot of stuff in China. I'm a member of 2 of its academies of the social sciences, you know. But anyhow, some actors in China. China is building a huge port in Rakhine State. Rakhine State, where the Rohingya lived, where they were expelled, all that you saw in the news area, is a state that has long been forgotten, isolated, very poor. It looks onto, the quickest connection is to Bangladesh, all that you have read in the newspapers. Religious persecution was a reasonable invocation, you know, to say this is religious. Yeah, there was religious persecution. But the question is, you know, what else was there? And so the else that was there is that, number one, in Myanmar, the military run the economy. They have been doing land grabs for a very long time, only not in that particular state because it's so isolated and so nobody thought there was anything interesting happening there. Then the Chinese, who have a whole new project, you know, that involves 64 countries. I think you've heard of it. It has a strange name. So one part of that, and I was looking at the contract, so I could see it, and I wrote an article, and a lot of people said, you're wrong, there's nothing to do with that. So now it's finally in the open. And so what happens is the Chinese are building a huge port, $7.3 billion port, in Rakhine State, this poor abandoned state, not where the Rohingya villages were necessarily, but in that state. The military have just said, if the Rohingya come back, sure, they can come back, but they have to go way further north, not here, because this is now valuable land. So there is a big port, because the Chinese need to get into the Indian Ocean, need to get to the providers of oil, need to access Africa. They want to have that port, and that's a good location for them. They are not on good terms with the Indians, so this is an added importance. And then they are developing a huge economic zone, and so recently, one of the top generals in the government said, I already mentioned it, but I say it again. This was a formal statement. Burned land belongs to the military. So the Pope went there. He didn't mention Rohingya. We all noticed that part. But the issue really is that the military used the question of religion to get at a very basic, you know, economic project, profit project, etc., etc. And the debate that I have been sort of part of has been quite astounding because everybody said this is just religious persecution. And so to me, what happened, Myanmar is an extreme case. But what it also signals is how easy you can have a dominant interpretation when there is something else happening. Now, I'm all for economic development. I am not, of course, for this type of persecution and this type of displacing people because, you know, there is another project. Nor am I criticizing the Chinese for wanting that port. I think the really guilty party, frankly, the conduct of the military, how they have conducted it. And they have been doing this for a long time. This is one of the most brutal cases, instances. But, you know, so to stick just with the language of refugees and migrants seems to me may have worked in certain situations in the past. It still may work today. But to me, the Myanmar case, which is an extreme case, where all the global media, very intelligent people, just kept saying, this is religion, religion, religion. Only now, Amnesty International made an extraordinary analysis of the burning and said, there is something else that is also happening here. They had not understood that the big port is getting built, but it tells me, I come back to the beginning, which is the rise, the emergence of certain conditions, certain logics that are difficult to associate with a familiar subject, migration, refugees, you know. And for me, given how I work materials, the whole question of the refugees and the migration is just one setting. This also happens when I talk about finance. There are similar sort of things that do not get registered, that do not get seen, because they are emergent and they don't fit in the strong heart of the paradigm. So this is sort of an alert call, and it also, and I conclude, it brings me back to where I started, which is really sort of this before method zone. You know, because method is already, by definition, a partial account. When a new method emerges, it's strong, it enables, we see more, but then it gets a bit, you know, other things happen and people academics keep sticking with the method. And so in that sense, the Myanmar case is like incredibly powerful, because we could all see the horror that was happening, but the only explanation that we had, not me, but you know, a generic we, was religious persecution. And now we know that religion was used, but it was not necessarily all. I mean, religious persecution is there, but it does not explain the fullness of what happened. I leave you with these thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention.